Aaron's sons, 2 of the priests, who knew the law of Moses. They had just gotten finished obeying the law of Moses in chapters 8 and chapter 9. But now in chapter 10, Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took their respective fire pans, and after putting fire in them, placed incense on it, and offered strange fire before the Lord. Now what does Moses mean when he writes strange fire? He tells us what he means. Which he had not commanded them. And fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. There is a striking, glaring contrast between chapters 8 and chapter 9 and now chapter 10. Chapter 8, they did just as the Lord commanded. Chapter 9, they did just as the Lord commanded. Chapter 10, they did not do what the Lord commanded. And the same fire from heaven that God had sent down and burned up all those sacrifices is the same fire now that comes down and burns up the people who offer the sacrifices. Because they did not do what God commanded. You see, they were coming into the holy presence of God. And they thought, well, I don't have to do it God's way, I can do it my way. And God said, Nadab and Abihu, you forgot. When you come into God's presence, you've got to do it God's way. Turn over to Leviticus chapter 16. Leviticus chapter 16 is the law of Moses relative to the Day of Atonement. And we're not going to discuss a whole lot of this Day of Atonement, except I want you to understand something. The laws that are given in Leviticus chapter 16 relative to the Day of Atonement are related to Nadab and Abihu's sin. Back in chapter 10. Look at what Moses writes, chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. The Lord spoke to Moses, notice, after the death of his 2 sons of Aaron, when they had approached the presence of the Lord and died. And the Lord said to Moses, tell your brother Aaron that he shall not enter at any time into the holy place inside the veil before the mercy seat which is on the ark, for he will die. For I will appear in the cloud over the mercy seat. And so the point Moses is making is, in order to keep the tabernacle holy and consecrated, if you look back at chapter 15, verse 31, thus you shall keep the sons of Aaron separated from their uncleanness, so that they will not die in their uncleanness by their defiling my tabernacle that is among them. Moses is saying there is a relationship between the death of Nadab and Abihu and keeping yourselves consecrated. Chapter 16, verse 29. Verse 29 of this law, notice what God says. This shall be a permanent statute for you in the 7th month. On the 10th day of the month you shall humble yourselves and not do any work, whether the native or the alien who sojourns among you. You shall humble yourselves, the New American Standard says. Your translation might say, afflict yourselves. What does Moses mean when he says you need to afflict yourselves when you come to worship? You look at the commentaries, and most commentaries will say afflict yourselves means you need to fast. You need to fast before you come to the presence of God. Well, just because the commentaries say that's what it means doesn't necessarily mean that's what it means. So I did some little research. Fasting is not mentioned in the law of Moses at all. The word fasting is not mentioned in Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It's not mentioned at all. There is one reference to somebody going without eating, which of course is fasting, and that's Moses in Exodus chapter 34. Otherwise, fasting is not mentioned in the law of Moses. The first time fasting is mentioned is in the book of Judges, chapter 20, verse 26, when there was a civil war in Israel between the tribes, the 11 tribes, and the tribe of Benjamin. But in that passage, God does not command the Israelites to fast. So that threw up a red flag. I got to look at all the rest of the 24 examples of fasting in the Old Testament, and you know what? God never commands the Israelites to fast. On none of those occasions where fasting is listed, sometimes fasting is mentioned along with other acts of worship, but never is God commanding the Israelites to fast, except one time. Let's move our way to that one exception. Let's stop off in Isaiah chapter 58. Now stick your finger here in Leviticus chapter 10 because we're coming to it in just a second. But look at Isaiah chapter 58. Isaiah chapter 58 verses 3 through 6. And look at what Isaiah says. Now this is several hundred years after Moses gave the law at Mount Sinai, several hundred years. And fasting has become more and more prevalent. The Israelites fast, yes, they have 5 official fasts by the time Isaiah comes along. 5 fasts. None of them are commanded by God. Isaiah chapter 58, beginning in verse 3. Isaiah the prophet says, "Why have we fasted?" That is, the people are asking God, "Why have we fasted and you do not see? Why have we humbled ourselves and you do not notice? Behold, on the day of your fast you find your desire." This is God talking back to the Israelites now. "Behold, on the day of your fast you find your desire and drive hard all your workers. Behold, you fast for contention and strife and to strike with a wicked fist. You do not fast like you do today and to make your voice heard on high. Is it a fast like this which I choose? A day for a man to humble himself? Is it for bowing one's head like a reed, or for spreading out sackcloth and ashes as a bed? Will you call this a fast, even an acceptable day to the Lord?" What's God saying? God's saying, you fasted, but it wasn't for me. You fasted, but you weren't afflicting your souls. You weren't doing what I told you to do. Now look over at Joel, just a moment, and then we'll turn back to Leviticus before we get to the New Testament application of this whole principle. Look at Joel, Joel chapter 2. Here in Joel, God does tell the people to fast. But I want you to look at how he says it. Joel chapter 2, verses 12 and 13 specifically. "Yet even now, declares the Lord, return to me. Return to me with all of your heart," God says, "and with fasting and weeping and mourning. And rend your heart and not your garments. Now return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness, and relenting of evil." So what does God say to the Israelites through Joel? He does say to fast, but I'm suggesting to you that even fasting here is a metaphor for afflicting your souls. Joel says, rend your heart, not your garments. Fast on the inside, not on the outside. What does afflict yourselves mean back in Leviticus chapter 16? Afflict yourselves means to humble yourself with inner pain and with contrition. Afflict yourselves in the law of Moses says that you need to be humble and you need to deny yourself when you come into God's presence. I made this point last Sunday in my lesson. Worship is not where we come and we get entertained. Worship is not where we come and we say, hey, I had a really great time. No, worship is where we come into the presence of God and we say, God, you are worthy of my praise. Worship is God-centered. And God says in order for you to worship acceptably, you've got to deny yourself. What we do in worship is different than what we do at home. That's the message here. You see, the Israelites were not afflicting their souls even as they were afflicting their body. Their hearts were not humble. And so, if we could say that the key attribute of God is holiness, let me suggest to you that the key characteristic that God expects out of man is humility. When you come into God's presence, you humble yourself. You afflict your souls. Now, look back at Leviticus chapter 10. Look back at Leviticus chapter 10 and notice verse 3. Notice verse 3. After God struck down Nadab and Abihu, notice what God says. Leviticus chapter 10 and verse 3. Moses said to Aaron, it is what the Lord spoke, saying, by those who come near me, by those who worship, I will be sanctified. You will keep me separate from what you do at home. I will be sanctified, God says, and I will be honored before all people. You see, that's given right after God strikes Nadab and Abihu dead for giving God something to worship that God didn't tell him to give him. God says, you weren't sanctifying me and you weren't honoring me. Now, one more passage before we get to the New Testament. Look down at verses 10 and 11. Leviticus chapter 10, verses 10 and 11. Still, the context of Nadab and Abihu get struck down by fire, God says, so as to make a distinction between what is holy and what is profane, between what is unclean and what is clean. And in verse 11, so as to teach the sons of Israel all the statutes that the Lord has spoken to them through Moses. So God says, after killing Nadab and Abihu, He says, you need to remember. This is holy. That is common. This is clean. That's unclean. Keep the distinction. Now, applying this principle to us in the New Testament times. The New Testament also emphasizes God's holiness. In such passages as 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 16, where Paul says that God dwells in unapproachable light. The only way we can approach God is through Jesus Christ. The only worship that's acceptable to God on this side of the cross is worship that is offered through Jesus Christ, in the name of Jesus Christ. And God delights in true worship. John chapter 4 and verse 23, Jesus tells the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well, He says, God desires true worshipers who worship Him in spirit and in truth. The lesson this morning is on preparing to worship. Next Sunday, we'll look at our instruments of music. In John chapter 4, verses 23 and 24, Jesus says that our worship has to be in spirit and in truth. And truth, of course, means it has to be in accordance with God's law. It has to be in accordance with the truth, the New Testament. But the Spirit is what has to be under when it comes into God's presence. Jesus says, you've got to worship me in your spirit. That means that when we assemble together to worship, our minds need to be engaged. And our hearts need to be engaged in worship. And if our minds are engaged in worship, and if our hearts are engaged in worship, then our spirits are going to be engaged in worship. God is a spirit. And our worship is spiritual in nature. And in order for us to worship God as a spirit, it's got to involve our spirits. Be involved in worship. So, when God struck down Nadab and Abihu, if we were to read on down through there, God gives the injunction not to drink wine, which suggests the possibility that Nadab and Abihu were under the influence of alcohol when they worshipped wrong. Under what influence might we be when we assemble together to worship God on a Sunday morning? Let me suggest some things that I thought of that might hinder us from worshiping in spirit from one Sunday to the next. It might be that we had an argument with our spouse or our children at home. And if we have a fuss with our spouse at home, it affects our minds and it might affect our worship. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7, the Apostle Peter tells husbands that we need to dwell with our wives according to knowledge so that our prayers will not be hindered. It is possible for our relationship with our spouse to be so negative that it affects us in our worship to God. What are some other things that might affect us? Have you stayed up late on Saturday night? Now, some people are sleeping on Sunday morning because they take medication. You understand that? They didn't sleep well, whatever. But are we sleeping on Sunday morning simply because we stayed up Saturday night late to entertain ourselves? Is that why we can't focus on God on Sunday morning? Shame on us if we're under the influence in such a way. Is it because we have an entertainment mentality? I want to be entertained. What's in it for me? That's the American attitude nowadays. What's in it for me? Worship is not what's in it for me. Now, we get something out of it indeed if we worship according to God's requirements in spirit and truth. But worship is showing our praise to God. Worship is God-centered, not me-centered. So, in an entertainment mentality, it might be affecting how I worship. Maybe it's the cares of this world, or maybe it's business interests that are impacting how I worship God. If any of these are the case, then what can I do to better prepare myself for worship? When we were on the mission field, one of the men on one of the other families, regularly on Saturday night, we got together, had a devotional Saturday night. Invariably, when he prayed, he said, God, help us to prepare ourselves for worship tomorrow. Are you thinking on Saturday night what you're going to be doing Sunday morning? Maybe we should. What are some things that we can do to help prepare ourselves to worship God in spirit, keeping in mind what happened to Nadab and Abihu? Number one, we need to understand what worshiping in spirit and in truth means. Worship is not a game, it's not a joke, it's not entertainment. Again, worship is showing God